And I thought maybe we would start with just a very simple question on how, in the last 10 years, the writing and teaching of the civil rights movement, broadly defined, has changed. How have you've been a part of this, and how have you seen the scholarship transforming the way we understand this movement?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. It's been huge in a lot of ways when we think about the transformation pedagogically. One, it's been about the actors. So Black women, just like we see now with BLM, have taken center stage. I'm thinking about Martha Jones's Vanguard, about Black women and voting rights. Our colleague Ashley Farmer and her book on Black women and Black power. There's been so much different works that center the activism in the lives of Black women during this movement and connect it to our own. The Black Power period has been rethought and reimagined. When I was coming, and we were both in grad school, this is almost 30 years ago now, Black Power was looked upon as the evil twin that wrecked the civil rights movement. These were activists who practiced politics without portfolio and really dragged down a much more noble movement. And now we're looking at Black Power in multiple ways, where we see, one, the movement itself was not just about Molotov cocktails, rhetorical or otherwise. It connects with Black elected officials and a new generation of Black mayors in the Congressional Black Caucus and Shirley Chisholm. Certainly you have the Black Panthers and Stokely Carmichael. It connects with Black studies and Black students, but it also connects with the Cold War, as you know, Jeremy. The Black Power activists really inspire. We think about, you've done a terrific book in the Global 68, really the book on Global 68 as far as I'm concerned. And what happened? What was the inspiration that hits Europe, Africa, China, Asia? The whole world was on fire, and Black Power is part of those iterations, in a big way. We find out that Black Power impacted the Black middle class and professional associations. You have folks who, and there's a colleague who's done great works on Black folks who are creating associations of Black psychologists and sociologists, and sort of a professionalization. So there's actually different ideological wings within the movement, right? Including those who are Black capitalists, right? So that's one. The multiracial, multicultural character of the civil rights movement, looking at Latinx, and not just Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, but we've done some great civil rights work on Black and Brown power during this period. And not just farm workers inclusive, but the way in which civil rights and Black power forces Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, folks who now we broadly say are Latinx, to reconsider themselves, right? So there's that. There's the global aspect of this, right? The Cold War civil rights. Mary Dujak, Thomas Borselman, Penny Von Eschen, Brenda Gale Plummer have looked at, hey, how did the world conceive of civil rights? And how was the United States forced to actually at times do things much more progressive politically than they might have without Soviet anti-American propaganda, but also third world criticisms that were based in, at times, a bigger belief in American democracy than Americans had. And in this way, I'm thinking one of the best anecdotes of Stokely Carmichael, when I did the research on that book, was Stokely Carmichael meeting up with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh saying how he remembered listening to Marcus Garvey in Harlem in the 1920s. But one thing we have to remember, Ho Chi Minh, and Jeremy knows this, was a fan of Woodrow Wilson. He admired Woodrow Wilson. He believed in the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson rhetorically believed in political self-determination for these global nations. And Ho Chi Minh is shocked. He's shocked when the French don't leave Vietnam. And because remember, after World War I, we should have, Africa, Asia, all should have been liberated. We could have had a plan for that liberation, but all of it, right? And Ho Chi Minh is shocked. And what happens to so many people actually at times go towards Marxism and communism as a liberation strategy after being disappointed by us, right?
That's right. That's
So it's a
absolutely
really
right.
extraordinary, and we're getting all that great scholarship, including community studies. We're getting such we're getting studies about folks who are in prison. We're getting all these different studies. So the field has become so much more immense, so much more sophisticated, and also LGBTQIA. So we're getting real studies of communities that have been marginalized and now are at the center of our new understanding.
Fantastic. And that leads beautifully into a number of the questions from the teachers. We have John Underwood, who has asked a great question. In the early civil rights movement, there seemed to be tangible steps toward equality, right? Voting rights, fair housing, the pressure that led to the Voting Rights Act, for example, et cetera. What steps do you see in the current civil rights movement as the next tangible steps toward racial equality? What are going to be those next milestones?
Yeah, I think the next milestones, and I think this is where Black Lives Matter, and you know, we had Sherilyn Ifill up here, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and Jeremy's you know, part of that, and you know, she is the head of the Legal Defense Fund, and she's a great example, LDF, where, and she's connected to a movement for Black Lives too, where they have these policy agendas of a few things. People have talked about reinvesting in communities instead of punishment and police. But at a federal, state, and local level, already in Austin, we're doing that, right? So that's one. We have to have hard conversations about racial segregation in public schools and neighborhoods. And we have to have policy incentives for people, especially who just really want to desegregate. So we start there. So it's not this idea of saying communities that don't want to do it, you're forcing them to do it, but there are communities that actually do want racial integration, including right here in Austin, and we don't have the policies that incentivize that. The criminal justice system, you know, people go as far left as saying abolish prisons to just saying that, look, there's 500,000 people in prison connected to the old drug war who should not be in prison, right? Because especially now that many states have legalized marijuana. This idea of a universal basic income is also a policy agenda. Reforming immigration and giving immigrants, including, yes, we have 11 million undocumented. They're not all Spanish speakers. There are white and Black immigrants and Asian immigrants and South Asian immigrants who are undocumented here, giving them a pathway to citizenship. So these are some of the things, ending the cash bail system, right? So I think that when you look at the Black Lives Matter agenda, and now we know because of voter suppression, a John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act that says that every single American citizen has the right to vote in a free and unfettered way. And we don't make it harder for people to vote, we make it easier, but we need federal standards that states recognize. We do, right? So those are just some of the things, but I think one of the things, I love the question, John, I think one of the most interesting aspects of this contemporary civil rights movement, and I think Jeremy watches and follows this closely too, is how policy driven it is. You know, I mean, we see it right here in Austin. Activists, I think activists now in 2020 are more obsessed with policy than the activists from the 60s. They are obsessed with policy, right? And they want anti-racist policy. They want policy that is pro poor people and pro people who are neurodiverse, pro LGBTQIA, pro women. So it's very, very interesting that people have gotten more into the policy weeds and debates now than in the 1960s.
And I think criminal justice is such a great example of this, yes, right? Because yes, it's hard to look at the criminal justice system and not see such disparities that have to be addressed that require that detailed policy work. Anthony Gallos asks a great question too. He asks about the overlap between communism, anti-communism, Cold War pressures, and civil rights. Some of the work that Robin D.G. Kelly, yes, and Mary Dudziak did. You know, to what extent and how did civil rights organizations separate themselves from communist branding and the efforts by opponents to basically claim that they were communists?
Well, this is a great question. I'll go back to the 1930s here. Jacqueline Dodd Hall, you know, Timothy Tyson or Robert F. Williams, Mark Nason, Robin Kelly, Hammer and Hoe. So basically, in a very short way, when we think about the 1930s and the 1940s, And even if we go earlier to 1919 and Sacco and Vanzetti, by the late 19th, early 20th century, there's going to be European, Jewish, Italian, German immigrants who bring different radical political and economic philosophies to the United States. It's not just Marxist-Leninism. It's socialism, it's syndicalism, it is anarchism and others, okay? And anarchism as a political philosophy, not as just throwing Molotov cocktails, by the way, too, right? Anarchism as this critique of statism, right? That's what we mean, right? And so, and there's something connect, when you think about anarchism from that perspective, there are certain libertarians who would agree with themes of anti-statism. They don't want a state that's too big to fail, a bank that's too big to fail, anything that's too big to fail, because it says, look, it robs me of my freedom, right? So from that perspective, by the 1930s and 40s, there were many different sort of what we might call social democratic left-wing perspectives that were part and parcel of American democracy. Yes, there had been scares. There's the Red Summer of 1919, where a precursor to the FBI really terrorizes left-wing and progressive groups. And that summer, a lot of Black folks are killed in anti-Black pogroms as well. But by the 1930s and 40s, some of this is because of the Great Depression. There were many, many Americans who were open to social democratic ideas. That's how FDR gets the New Deal and the rhetoric of the New Deal passed, right? So that's one. After 1948, this becomes much more difficult, right? And it becomes much more difficult because of the Cold War. The Marshall Plan on some levels is brilliant, but it sets us up in these different camps. Now, some of this makes sense when you think about, yes, communist totalitarianism, Stalinism, right? But what happens is that it really filters and starts to cast a broad brush against Black activists who are just, they're pro-American, but they're anti-racist, right? So they absolutely love the United States. They're patriots like Medgar Evers, but they're against Jim Crow racial segregation. They get tarred as communists, as subversives, as anti-American. They're the exact opposite, but they get successfully tarred. That's why when we think about King, it makes sense that by 55, Dr. King is a religious leader, and he's not a labor leader. He's not a secular leader in that way, because so many secular leaders like Paul Robeson, like Claudia Jones, like people, some who had been connected to the Communist Party, many who hadn't, were tarred as communist, right? So basically that communist label is something that's very, very pernicious. Obviously it smacks of McCarthyism. And right now people are trying to turn the communist label into the socialist label. They're saying, look, because it hasn't stuck. The Black Lives Matter smear didn't stick. Part of it is because of what happened this year. But when they say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whoever is a socialist, the Democratic Party is a socialist, that becomes the new smear. But we have to understand that historically, this is a rhetoric that's been used to just tar and feather political opponents in ways that are basically anti-democratic.
Right, right. And it's used in a very generic way that's not specific. So it's not really about their policies. It's supposed to be somehow saying they're anti-American, right?
Yes, they're anti-American. Yeah.
So this leads perfectly to Daniel Simpson's question, which I think is another fantastic question. Why did people demonize Martin Luther King to such an extent, and Malcolm X as well, right? Was it just racism? Or were there other factors, and how do we understand the intersection between race, economic issues, and the various things that seem to create this overly violent reaction to figures, especially Martin Luther King, someone who's so moderate in so many ways?
Yeah, I think that King certainly, race is a part of this, right? So race is, so everything that we talk about with King and civil rights, so race is a part of it. So let's say that. So we definitely center race, but certainly King is also a revolutionary, even I think, in certain ways in the early 60s, because he's trying to upend the status quo. And that's what revolutionaries do. So can you imagine if people told us right now that the way we're living they're going to sit in around our house or our businesses until we change the way we're living. We might be very upset, even if they're not violent, because we might say to ourselves, look, the way we're living, the group of people we're around, we're good people. We just don't want to associate with these other people. My dad didn't associate with them. My mom didn't. Our grandparents didn't. Our great grandparents didn't. So why should we have to associate with them, right? So in certain ways, King is being pushed back against, because even as King is saying, look, I'm trying to end laws that are marginalizing Black people, it also could be reinterpreted as King is just trying to coerce us into following his lead, even when we don't want to. And that's why, again, Barry Goldwater says, look, he's not interested in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, because those things are already on the books and it's too much federal overreach, right? He doesn't say, hey, I just don't want Black people to have the right to vote. I don't want them to be able to go into public accommodations. So on one level, there's that. Then as King becomes more radical, yes, the criticism becomes King is anti-American. King, it's very important for us to understand, when King comes out against the Vietnam War, by the way, SNCC had come out against the Vietnam War in January of '66, Stokely Carmichael too. So people came out earlier than King. But when he comes out, all the polling data that we have, most Americans, a majority, are for the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War, a majority. The tide doesn't turn until after 1970, okay? And so when King comes out against the war, a majority of Americans are for the war. He's in a minority. Yes, he's with A.J. Musty, Benjamin Spock, but he's a minority. And so that does smack of anti-Americanism for some people. Another thing is, by the time he's saying universal basic income, people are saying, that's communist. What do you mean universal basic? We're going to just pay people for doing nothing, right? So yeah, there is, and then the fact that King is Black, is going to amplify all that. So yeah, people can have real differences with King, but it also depends on how do we interpret King's call, because in the context of the Great Depression, what King was calling for was not very radical. Right? It wasn't very radical. But in the context of the late 1960s, where America is in its last decade of global supremacy, right? Our 2 decades of supremacy, really, right after the Second World War, even though, as Jeremy knows, there's food shortages, there's all kinds of stuff that makes Truman so unpopular, he almost loses. And the only reason Truman doesn't lose is because there's 3 other candidates. That's why he doesn't lose. You've got Thomas Dewey, but you also have Strom Thurmond, and you also have Henry Wallace. So if you could have just had one other candidate, Truman would not have been president from 1949 to 1953. He just wouldn't have. He was an unpopular president. And so there's those shortages, but really we get out of those shortages and we have supremacy for a couple of decades. So in a lot of ways, the best time to be an American, we're not talking about Jay-Z or Barack Obama, Beyonce. It's great for them to be Americans now. Best time for most of us to be Americans is really that sweet spot from 1948, 49, all the way up until 1970. And then we're going to get OPEC and stagflation and all that different stuff. First 2 years of Nixon's term are not that bad economically. We start descending and descending. The Carter years are a disaster. The Ford Carter years are a disaster. And part of it is we lost our mojo and didn't know what. We refused to do deficit spending. We had soaring inflation, soaring interest rates, and we refused to give people a universal basic income. And that was one of the reasons why the Democratic Party has an internecine war. Carter refuses to support the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill by '76. So yeah.
So we've got a great question from Tina Miller about busing, which of course came up in the Democratic debates.
Big time.
So she asks about the school busing movement of the '70s. She brings up one of the most interesting cases, Boston, where there's a full-fledged revolt against busing. How should we understand? It's easier to understand the argument for busing in a certain way because it was an argument for integration.
Yeah.
How do we understand the failure of busing and what comes after that?
Yeah, so there's a great book by Matthew Delmont on busing. It's a fantastic book. He was at Arizona State, now he's at Dartmouth. And it's an awesome book. And Jean Theo Harris has done great work on this too. Obviously, Tony Lucas and the Common Ground book from 1968 is this masterwork of narrative nonfiction. No, so one thing we have to make clear: only 5% of students were ever under court-ordered busing. 5%. Okay, so and busing was one of many different strategies to desegregate public schools. The ones that worked were really like the first instance is 1969 in the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District. And there's another great book, the labor economist who's at the Berkeley Policy School, Rucker Johnson, has a book I teach called Children of the Dream: Why School Integration Works. And it's really a brilliant book. He's got a lot of big data sets about showing outcomes for Black children positively who were in racially integrated schools from the 60s to the present. It's a great book that I think all the teachers here should get. It's called Children of the Dream, Rucker C. Johnson. It's really amazing. So only 5%. Now, the reason why busing doesn't work is because opponents of busing are able to utilize the civil rights movement's tactics against it. They're able to, there's an acronym in Boston, ROAR, ROAR, and it's sort of restoration of our rights. It's, you know, and it's basically a white supremacist movement, but it's a white supremacist movement that sort of makes sense to the extent that it says, look, why can't my kid go to their own neighborhood school? So busing was not a great strategy for desegregating neighborhoods, because if you desegregated neighborhoods, you wouldn't need busing because you'd have enough proportional racial integration where kids were going to go to the same school. And it's the same now. Like if the Eanes school district was 8% Black, which is what Austin is, you'd have 8% Black children in the school district, and that would be actually racial integration there. In other places, if it's 18%, that's what it would be. The reason you don't have it is really because of residential segregation. So what opponents of busing did, and remember Joe Biden supports this, is that they were able to divest busing away from racial justice and racial integration by saying that this is government overreach and they're taking away my personal choice of where to send my children to school. The reality was that this was, people were against busing, you were actually against racial integration. That's the reality. That's the reality. But as a policy, and by calling it busing, right? And really one of the things we have to remember is Judge Garrity's order in Massachusetts pitted two poor Black and white neighborhoods against each other. This was a mistake. So doing Southie and Roxbury together, that was a mistake. They were only a mile apart, but they were gulfs apart in terms of their access to the American dream. And what for the white folks in Southie, the busing order destroyed the last piece of currency they had, which was their whiteness and their privilege. They didn't have economic privilege. They had racial privilege, but not economic privilege. And having Black kids come and, you know, invade South Boston High School was the last straw in 1974. And again, when we see the footage of throwing Molotov cocktails at school buses with Black children in them, you're really seeing what the depth and breadth of the problem was. And that's why King, you know, just 5-6 years previously had said right before his assassination, we have some difficult days ahead of us, because he understood by that point to really be shoulder to shoulder with each other and to build that beloved community, you were going to have to acknowledge that kind of hatred that you saw in Southie and fix it. You know what I mean? And fix it. And King was saying, well, part of the way we're going to fix it is by elevating those groups of people. And that's why what's interesting about the Poor People's Campaign, it's a very interesting campaign because it's racially specific and universal simultaneously.
Yep.
right? So King is saying, I'm bringing all these poor Black people, and guess what? All these poor white people, basically the people who J.D. Vance talks about, right? The holler, right? And I teach that book too. I teach hillbilly elegy. He's saying, I'm bringing all of them to Washington, D.C. And a first step of bringing and building that beloved community is that all of these folks deserve a universal basic income, right? And I think he's right. Like, because if you say everybody's going to have this floor, right, you can come together in a way that's non-competitive. Yeah.
Right. And it's not taking anything away from anyone. I mean, the point you make is that it's such an important point, you know, especially for the poor white kids in Boston. They were losing their privilege.
Yes.
Boston, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The one thing they had.
The one thing they had was that, look, my neighborhood, my school, I'm not sitting next to Black kids. I'm not going to lunch with Black kids. And let's not forget that if you racially integrate South Boston High, parents are going to be very, very fearful of interracial intimacy, both romantic and otherwise, right? That's a big part of privilege too, saying, look, I don't have Black grandchildren. You see what I'm saying? So it's all, privilege is all relative, but that's what happened there. But it's interesting how, again, Joe Biden could still dodge, you know, President-elect Biden, and it's so fascinating that it's Vice President-elect Kamala Harris who called him out, because really, I understand politically why he didn't support busing in Delaware, right? I understand that, but we have to admit that those who did not support busing were against racial justice. That's thing. So we can understand it politically, but we have to speak truth to power and say, you're against racial justice for these reasons, ...
Yeah. It's a really important point, right? That there are all different kinds of racial prejudice. And one is often in not the racist things you say, but the things you don't say and the way you frame issues, right?
Yes.
And that's part of what we want our students to be attentive to. We want them to learn that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to turn, Peniel, to the section now.